Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 3 o'clock session in this room. I was just saying to one of the other speakers that there's such a comfortable vibe here. Also, hello to people joining online. Is there a camera somewhere? Or is it just all? Hello, online people. Welcome. It's great to have you here, kind of mentally and wherever you are physically. So people in the room, they're just really chilled. They're like sitting around the tables. They haven't got their slippers on, but honestly, it feels like they could have. They feel really comfortable. They've been here for 3 days. They're all best mates. They're all going around each other's houses later. So I am Timandra Harkness. I'm here to chair this session. I've been asked to do this because I'm very interested in how we disagree. I did a radio series called How to Disagree, How to Have Better Arguments. BBC, I'm afraid, promptly sold it to Audible. So if you want to hear it, you have to go on Audible and listen to it. I did a follow-up series called Steel Manning, about how to steel man your opponent's arguments, in which I rashly picked 5 people I disagreed with, sent them off to have their argument strengthened, and then brought them back to have an argument with. I know, exactly. What was I thinking? But it kind of works as a radio series, and that is still on the BBC Sounds if you want to hear it. But I'm just here to chair. We have 2 fantastic speakers. We have just under 45 minutes now. So they're going to give a short introduction, and then over to you people in the room for your thoughts. Please don't bother trying to pretend it's a question. We're here for discussion. Just make your points. And also, people online, you can feed your thoughts, questions, points, whatever you like, through. And Izzy, I think, is going to feed them through to me. Is Izzy in the room? Okay, Izzy, she'll be here. Don't worry, she'll be here before you need to ask your thing. So, the 2 speakers that we have in the room. Luke Tryl, am I saying your name right, Luke? Luke Tryl, fantastic. He is the UK director of More in Common, which is a research organisation tackling polarisation, breaking down barriers and understanding what the public think. So you can precisely see why he's a brilliant speaker for this. Previously, he was at policy and research agency Public First, and before that in the education sector. And then here on the other side of me is Kirsty Sedgman from the University of Bristol, who is an audience expert. Her latest book is called On Being Unreasonable. So I asked about her other books and she went, oh, they're just boring academic books. So any boring academics in the room, feel free to look her up. But she specialises in culture, communication and human behaviour. So we're going to start with Luke, short introduction from Luke, and then a short introduction from Kirsty, and then over to all of you. Take it away, Luke.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here. I thought it'd be useful just to run through a little bit of the research that we've done in this area as a bit of a kind of prompt and starting point for the discussion, but I promise I won't make it death by PowerPoint, particularly not at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That said, is there a clicker? Is it here? Great. So I'll skip through that. So I don't know if any of you have heard of More in Common before or looked at our work, but we were set up in 2016 following the very tragic murder of Joe Cox. And our broad mission is to look at the big issues, those issues which threaten to either pull societies apart or could be the issues which actually bring people together, and to really try and put the public at the heart of those conversations, to look at there are areas, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with lots of them, where often what you might call elite opinion, those people in positions of power and influence, actually misses what some people who don't spend their entire day on Twitter or on social media really think. And so we think that by having that better understanding of what the public think and how that differs across different kind of segments and groups of the public, actually we can then have a better conversation on how we move forward on some of these issues. And the way that we operate, we're not just in the UK, we have offices in the US, Poland, France, Germany, soon potentially to be Brazil as well, which will be a different challenge. But in each of the countries that we work in, we have done a segmentation of the public. And unlike lots of traditional segmentations, which I'm sure lots of you in the space will be used to working with, we don't put any demographics into our segmentation at all. Instead, it's entirely based on people's social psychology and values. So what goes into our segmentation, the formula, is things like Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, Karen Stenner's work on authoritarianism, and it spits out, in the UK, these 7 groups. And these groups, we think, are a more interesting lens to look at what the public think, because they show you not just what people think, but why they think it. And I'll very quickly run through them, because I think it's useful for understanding the rest of the conversation. So firstly, we have progressive activists. This is probably the most familiar to lots of you. Lots of people in the climate and nature space, in fact, the vast majority, sit in this group because they're a group who are particularly motivated by tackling injustice. They're quite active, they're engaged, most likely to have been to a rally or a protest, signed a petition. Another group who are called the civic pragmatists. They are quite similar in terms of their beliefs to progressive activists, but tend to express it more through volunteering and community work than through kind of more political events like a protest. So, neighborhood cleanups, bake sales, that sort of thing. It's a little bit of a caricature, but you get the picture. Disengaged battlers, the most economically insecure of the groups, very often feel like they're working to live, living to work, much more dependent on the state and the system, but often have quite a bad experience of it. It's also the most urban of the groups, and the group with the most people from minority ethnic communities. Established liberals, kind of comfortable, outward looking. I sometimes describe them as Cameronite conservatives. They're sort of Remain voting, economically right leaning. Flip side of them are loyal nationals. They're basically your red wall voters. They are socially conservative, more economically left, used to vote Labour, switched quite significantly to the Tories in the last election, now switched quite dramatically back. That's not what we're here to talk about. Disengaged traditionalist is basically a white van person. So strong belief in self-reliance, you get where you get to in life by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and backbone conservatives kind of does what it says on the tin. So that's our lens. They are the 7 groups, and they're roughly of equal size. They're sort of between 12 and 17% of the population. And this just gives you an idea of why a segment lens might give you more nuance than something like age, for instance. So if you look at how worried people are about climate change, actually the difference isn't between old and young. It's between basically those segments who are more engaged, more engaged in current affairs and the national conversation, and those who aren't. One of the interesting things I always think is that 70% amongst that blue group, the loyal nationals, because you will have heard time and time again, I'm sure, red wall voters, that group, they don't care about climate change. It's not a priority for them. It's a liberal, southern, metropolitan issue. Absolutely not the case. If you look at all of our data, in fact, loyal nationals, after the 2 most left-leaning groups, are among the most concerned. So it's also quite good for myth-busting as well. And when we ask the public every month, what are you most concerned about? And you can see there that, unsurprisingly, I think, for every group, cost of living comes top. It's followed by the NHS, and all of our focus groups at the moment, we get stories about the NHS, people unable to get GP appointments, A&Es feeling like war zones. And then you get climate and the environment. And I think what's particularly interesting is, firstly, that climate and the environment is so highly ranked as an issue. But if you compare it to below that, small boats, asylum and immigration issues, actually climate is not only ranked higher, but it's also less polarizing. So the split on the chart shows you the difference between how different groups rate it. And for all of the groups, climate is basically a top of the table issue, whereas something like small boats, the more socially conservative groups, are more likely to say it's an issue. The more socially liberal groups, less likely to say that it's an issue. And this, I think, gives you another way of looking at it. There are lots of issues, as you can imagine, where I spend my time sort of thinking, how do we find the common thread? How do we find consensus? As I say, we do a lot of work on migration and refugee issues, and it is quite contentious. Climate isn't like that. every single one of the segments is either more likely to say we're not doing enough than doing too much, and there is a clear majority for doing the right amount and not doing enough. There are very few people across those segments who think that we ought to be doing less. And that's a challenge, right? Because if you read a lot of the, and I'm not just talking about climate skeptics here, I'm talking about how the lobby, how the press cover an issue like climate, you wouldn't assume that was the case. You would assume actually there was a much bigger majority saying we're doing too much. And again, a big way in which we think these insights are useful is in challenging some of those misconceptions. But that doesn't mean that all of the segments approach an issue like climate and the environment in the same way. And I think it's really important when you're dealing with an issue like this, part of the way to avoid it becoming a culture war issue is about meeting people where they are. Why do different groups care about climate? So for progressive activists, it is something like climate justice, but actually that is quite a minority frame for lots of people. For other groups, it's how does it lead to lower bills? For that liberal optimistic group, it's how does it it's the potential of green technology. For that loyal national group, what's really interesting is its threat. It's the threat of climate change. And this is one of the really interesting things. So that loyal national group, as I said, sort of want to be tough on small boats. They want tougher sentences for criminals, and therefore it leads some people to think, therefore anti-climate. No. What actually happens is they want to be tough on criminals because they're worried about the threat of crime. They want to be tough on migration because they're worried about the threat of migration. They want us to tackle climate change because they're worried about the threat of climate. And so it's really important to engage with the groups on their own terms. And I don't think that is going to play because it's a PDF. But what's really interesting is we have, you often hear about local opposition to climate projects. And what we've found is that when you actually do focus groups with people in the areas where you're getting lots of noise, they're objecting to new solar farms or geothermal plants, actually the debate is being distorted by the people that write lots of letters in. And actually most people are, the medium person is sort of like, I'm a bit worried about it. I want to know what the short-term disruption is going to be on, the issue. Be honest with me, be frank with me about it. But actually, if you can convince me of the benefit, then I'll go for it. And I think we need to spend more time talking to people about the benefits of something like transition. I remember one woman who was in a focus group in Blythe, and she said to me, the thing about this climate change stuff is, I get it, we've got to do it, and my kids come home from school and tell me about it and how important it is, but you go to McDonald's and you can't drink a milkshake out of those straws anymore. And I think, I know it's just one example, but I think it's actually really important because there's a danger that people start to associate climate and environmentalism with just making their lives a little bit worse. They don't think it's, it's going to sort of, destroy society. But is it just going to make things that little bit more rubbish? And I think thinking about how you address that is really important. And very quickly, because I do want to shut up, but I just wanted to give just a few tips. So the first one is don't use framings like net zero. If you think about people's psychology, the word zero is actually quite scary. People think it's slightly unobtainable. They think it means basically having no emissions. The net in front of it doesn't negate that for people. Actually, if you talk about balancing greenhouse gases or same in, same out, people are much more supportive. It's about 10 points, which might not look like much, but actually in polling terms is really significant. Don't use climate justice as a frame. Obviously it matters for the base. It matters for engaging people who are already passionate to go out and take action. But actually, if you talk about costs of food and energy increasing, the number of times I in focus groups have spoken to people who've said the equivalent of, well, we can't be dependent on madmen like Putin for oil anymore, therefore we've got to do this. That kind of frame ends up being much more resident. And celebrate everyday actions. I think this is really, really important. I think sometimes there are people who think the way to persuade people is to tell them, oh no, all this recycling you're doing, it's just, it's tiny, it's peanuts, it doesn't matter. Actually, build on that. One of the things you find whenever you talk to Britons in focus groups is, they like having clear rules to follow. And they also like being a bit curtain twitchy about it as well. They're just like, well, I always do my recycling, but the neighbors, I always see them not separating out those plastics. Build on that, use that. And I know that's the sort of thing that those of us who are sort of, in campaigning or civil society or public service, sometimes we feel a bit squeamish about, but actually people on the other side would have no hesitation about doing that. And very finally, just backlash. What causes backlash? Number one, I have to say, is some of the activity of some activists, not all of them, and people in the UK really do believe in the right to protest. But when it starts to interfere with working people's day-to-day, that's when you get the pushback. And we have, it's not, I don't think it's in here, but we have a word cloud where we ask people to describe Just Stop Oil in one word. And the first thing we had to do before publishing it was take out lots of the expletives. 69% of people say that it divides society. Only 17% describe it as a force for good. And that's even more damning when you consider that 30% say that UK water companies, those people pumping the sewage into the rivers, are a force for good. So when you're coming below them, something's wrong. Speed. I think it's really important to talk about building on what we're doing. I know, again, that there's a temptation to go, we must do this now, the world's burning. That's quite scary for people and actually can lead to a bit of fatalism. Whereas if you talk about a pathway, a plan, a way of engaging them, and then finally, you've got to flip cost around. You've got to be able to convince people, firstly, that this isn't going to make their lives more expensive, but also really important is that those with the broadest shoulders will bear the burdens, and talk about all the ways there are to support people with making their own lifestyle choices. I'll stop there. There's lots more I can say, but it was just some starters for 10.
Fantastic. Thank you, Luke. Marvellous. You've still got a bit of energy left for applauding. So that was great. So you took us like a really big picture stuff, some practical tips. So Kirsty, I've asked you as an audience expert to also give us some high-level thoughts on communicating with audiences, but feel free to get into the weeds as well.
Of course, thanks so much for having me and for that really interesting talk. So when I say I'm an audience scholar, what I mean is that I'm endlessly fascinated by how we make sense of the world through the things that we watch and read and hear, how we can sit side by side in the same world, often watching the same event unfold, but come to such radically different conclusions about what it means. We just heard in this talk, you mentioned that you, with your work, studies not just what we think, but why we think it. And that chimes really nicely with the kind of work I do, because I explore that process in action by paying attention to discourse in action, to the process of language use, as we construct our own, often very different value systems, and then make value judgments that can conflict quite wildly with those of other people. So I explore all this in my new book on being unreasonable. The headline for that is really, in a world where we all think we're being reasonable and we think we're reasonable people, how can we work out what's right? So in a nutshell, what I'm doing there is exploring those discursive lines that we draw between good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable, appropriate and inappropriate, reasonable and unreasonable, lawful and unlawful. Obviously, in order to function as a society, we need mechanisms for drawing those lines. So I'm not questioning that at all. What I do ask, though, is just for us all to learn to think a bit more critically about who draws those lines, who historically has had that power, who the rules of engagement tend to prioritize, and who loses out or is even harmed. So my big argument in that book, and I think it might disagree with a couple of the points that you made, is that whether it's looking at conflicts over bad behavior on public transport or looking at things like climate protests, we have risked confusing the appearance of reasonableness polite debates and respectable clothing and the outward trappings of what seems like political competence, with true morally reasonable principles like justice and equality and fairness and the ecological stability that comes from having an actual livable world. And history, the history of social progress, tells us that sometimes under the right circumstances, we might need to give ourselves and other people permission to act unreasonably in pursuit of those goals. So I include a couple of statistics. In 1961, a Gallup poll found that 61% of Americans disapproved of the Freedom Riders, that activist movement that was seeking to test the Supreme Court ruling that segregation of transport facilities were unconstitutional. 57% thought diner sit-ins and other demonstrations were hurting the cause. So the point is that no expression in support of justice of any kind has ever been seen as universally acceptable. And we have to pay attention to that in order to move forwards. So chapter 5 of the book, I think, is especially relevant, which is about civic protest. Also perhaps chapter 6, which is on public reason and varying models of debate, and that big question of when civic discourse works and when it widens rather than collapses divisions, and why. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about this later, but I was asked by the organisers to start with a provocation. And protest really is that point in civic society where the language of lines tends to be heard loudest. They have gone too far. I support the right to protest, but not like that. But of course, we need to ask ourselves what separates a concerned public from an unruly mob, or a rational act of resistance from an unreasonable act of disruption. So I look at the histories of protests from the suffragettes to Stonewall to the civil rights movement to the climate protests today in order to develop what I call the Sedgman spectrum of reasonableness. Because first of all, we do have an increasing number of what I call unreasonably unreasonables, those deliberate contrarians and hate speech purveyors and greed is good individualists, the people who think that they should be allowed to do whatever they want with no consequence to anyone else and get away with it. But for certain progressive factions, I think that we've become so determined not to be like them that we've become something maybe even just as bad. We've become unreasonably reasonable, obsessed with tone policing and respectability politics and endless toothless debate, happy to allow the world to burn down around us as long as everyone seems to be talking to each other politely. And I think that's a mistake, because history shows that progress has always depended on those reasonably unreasonable people, those who understand that civic dissent and smashing down racist statues and no platforming, deliberate truth obfuscators might sometimes be the only way to make the world a better place. And I know it might sound like a radical argument, but I promise what I'm doing is making use of decades of scholarly debates like those by Martin Luther King and political scholars like Howard Zinn, who in 1970s, he argued that discussions over civil disobedience are topsy-turvy. Zinn reminds us that this is because the rule of law is topsy-turvy, the darling of the leaders and the plague of the people, and that just because something is illegal or disruptive, that doesn't make it wrong. Our problem, he said, isn't civil disobedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who've obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war, and millions have been killed. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves and while the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem. And I think I could absolutely make the case that the same is true today. And all too often, complaining about how people protest is just a way, and has always been a way, to avoid dealing with what is being protested. We risk focusing so constantly on method that it becomes the distraction for actually remedying the problem. And with things like the climate protests today, I think we can see this exact same topsy-turviness in action in those narratives of the virtuous vigilantes who physically assault the disruptive villains who are trying desperately to stop the world from burning down. So somehow we found ourselves in a time and at a place where the reasonable position is for people like you to make our case, the case of scientists, over and over and over again politely, while the government railroads through new oil contracts. And the unreasonable position is doing literally anything practical to stop it. So the question that I'm asking is, what if we stopped playing their game? And what if we turned those topsy-turvy narratives on their head?
Well, I'm delighted we've got a panel of two and deep disagreement between them. This is perfect. What better in a discussion about disagreement? So what I'd like to do is come straight out, and I'm sure you two have things to say directly to each other, but I'd like to come straight out to the audience, both in the room and online, and get your thoughts on this, and then I will come back again, hopefully a couple of times, and let you two express your thoughts. So what do people think? Should you be thinking about what is going on in the audience's mind and what's going to persuade them? Should you be refusing to follow the laws of what is reasonable and questioning who makes those rules about what is a reasonable way of disagreeing? Do you have thoughts? Have you, over the past few days or the past few years of being campaigners, have thoughts of your own or questions or problems that you'd like to bring and share to look for solutions? Any or all of that, or whatever you'd like to say, stick your hand up and let's see. Well, loads of hands. So who's got the microphone? Is that the microphone there? Marvelous. So let's go first to that person there with a hand up, and where was the other hands? And then another stripy. Yes, so very colourful top and then stripy jacket. Stripy, checky. Can't quite see in this light. Anyway, you first. Off you go.
Hello. This is very exciting. So, I love an argument. So my question is actually to both. I work for WWF. My most recent project has been the People's Plan for Nature, which was a citizens' assembly, and continues to roll with various different routes to trying to impact change. I fundamentally agree with you that we should be looking at social change when we think about the environment sector, but I question how useful, or not how useful, I think it's very useful. I question how relevant we have made our movement. When you look around the sector and you look around this room, not everyone is represented in this space. They may be represented through the segmentation that you demonstrate. There's obviously care there, but when the people that are gluing on do not look like the rest of the public and do not hold the same views, when the pragmatic policymakers do not look like the rest of the country and do not hold the same views, how do we even hope to shift things? The things that made Stonewall an effective movement is that the people that were directly affected were those that were speaking out, and those that were the ones that were pushing against Section 28. The reason that the civil rights movement is so effective is because you can see that the people who are oppressed are the people that are at the front and center of that movement. We have pushed the people who are most impacted by this crisis out of our sector through our practices and through our history. And we're not quite there yet at being ready to welcome people back in. So what is the practical way forward for a sector that is so ill-equipped to actually represent the public in bringing the public round on this crisis? Because that's the biggest question I think we have to face.
Fantastic for first question. And then if you'd like to just hand the microphone to there, and somebody up, yeah?
I was just going to ask, in terms of that sort of spectrum of activism styles and different things, I've been to a session before where they sort of talked about there being space and need for all types of activism in society. You've got to have those intense protests who actually kick things off, and they're probably by people who have been talking about it for 20 years. And then you need the maybe reasonable, policymakers to bring it into action and to finish the job off, perhaps. And do you agree with that, or do you think that there's more harm than good in either of those, I guess, extremes?
Okay, great question. I'm expecting rather different answers from the two speakers. Is there another question, or maybe one from online? Oh, there's one at the back. Yes, let's go to the back. And if there are any coming through from online, we'll take one or two of those. Yeah, okay, good. So we'll go to the back, and then we'll take some online questions. And then I will come back and let you two respond.
Hi there, thank you. Is is negativity and sort of bad comments and resistance to our messages actually a success metric in terms of reaching a broader audience? And should we embrace that? And can I convince my various employees that it's actually a good thing that we are reaching that wider audience they keep asking for?
So it's good to actually find people that you disagree with to persuade rather than talking to people you've already persuaded.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so do you say we've got some questions or points from online? Can you relay
We have.
them?
I don't know if you want to answer them first. Then
No,
we can
good. Just do this first, and then we'll come back because we'll only have time, I think, to come back a couple of times. So I'm gonna ask you both to respond between you to everything, but maybe not individually to everything. Off you go.
So a question from online is anyone doing anything to change the makeup of those involved in politics? It seems that in the current political setup, it's the same sort of people getting involved, getting elected, and running our country. We all complain about it, but nothing is actually done to change it. What are your thoughts?
Okay, very good. And related, I think, to the first point. And is there another one, or is it just that one at the moment?
There's one for Kirsty, which is asking about community organising in your writing, and whether you see disobedience as the only method of social change, or if there are other approaches as well.
Okay, great. So there's quite a few points there you'd like to both come back on. Would you like to start off, Kirsty, and then I'll come to Luke?
Sure. I think I'll address that last point and also yours together, which is actually, I'm absolutely not saying that disruptive, taking to the streets, even violence, is the only method of getting these things done. I absolutely believe that we need a series of different approaches. The thing that I am tackling in this book, again, it's my interest in discourse. And what really troubles me is that topsy-turvy narrative that happens whenever we have any kind of even extremely peaceful demonstration, because the movement fundamentally gets split into factions. There's always a tendency to leap on top of the behavior of people en masse and to say, oh, clearly some people in that crowd were behaving unreasonably, and then that feeds into the other side's absolute political desire to smear everybody as part of that movement as disruptive, selfish animals. And I think we need to be really, really careful about ever allowing our messaging to feed that narrative, whereas what we could be pushing home relentlessly is that actually the world is on fire. The only reasonable thing to do is to stop it. In that context, things like soup thrown at paintings, it's just a distraction to argue over whether those tactics are good or not. Because what they're exposing is the fact that there will be no paintings, there will be no art in a world where galleries are underwater and on fire sometimes at once. We have to be relentless and targeted and focused in our messaging, because we can see that the other side is too.
Okay, Luke, don't feel you have to respond to everything, but respond to whatever you like. And do, if you want to also respond to Kirsty.
Look, I see the appeal of protests like that. I see the deep frustration that comes, but when it comes to something like climate, I'm speaking personally here, like I'm more interested in winning than doing something which feels good to me. And what we know in this country is we have a consensus in favor of climate change. Like, that is quite unique. The biggest threat to that consensus from climate change comes from the climate movement being hijacked and people instead beginning to associate it with middle-class people who are self-indulgent, who have too much time in their hands and spend their time throwing paint on priceless works of art. Now, I don't want to put it too firmly, but that is it. That is the threat to the consensus. I think some of the other issues which Kirsty talked about were where you were trying to get from a situation where you had quite an unpopular minority, particularly in civil rights, and actually there was a difference then. You had to do some of the louder, more disruptive tactics in order to build consensus. Here we have the consensus. And actually what you find is, and we've done randomized controlled trials on Just Stop Oil's tactics, it lowers support for tackling climate change. And so if our interest is in winning, then I think we have to be quite firm in saying this stuff is damaging our end goal. and talking about the world burning, look, the world is burning. It is urgent. But when you get to a stage where people feel, oh my God, this is terrible, and we're going to impose some real hair shirt policy, and I'm already struggling with a cost of living crisis, actually, again, you threaten to make them think this is all just a bit too much. And that creates the space for the climate populists, who I think we're all united in wanting to tackle, to come in and prey on that as a result. So I guess that's my caution. And I would also say, I think occasionally, so look, I actually spent the first 5 years of my career working at Stonewall. And if you look at how we got to equal marriage, we didn't just go, we want everything immediately all at once. We started with the age of consent equalisation, then we did the armed forces, then a few years later we repealed Section 28, civil partnerships, then adoption, and then we got to equal marriage. And we took the public on a journey with us. The public realised the world doesn't fall down when you allow gay people to have civil partnership, and that laid the groundwork for us to get equal marriage, far better than vandalizing or trashing things might do. But I do put a but in here, and again, I think Kirsty's research is excellent and fascinating, but where I disagree is I do think there are different types of protests, and so do the public. You talk to the public about smashing a window at Goldman Sachs, and they'll go, well, the rich bankers, who cares? You talk to the public about stopping an ambulance from getting to a hospital, and they go, that's not right, or stopping a tube train at Canning Town, taking cleaners into work at 6 a.m. in the morning, and they go, that's not right. So there is a difference, and I think that difference actually is quite important, and we should be prepared to call it out. On the point, I do want to come back to the point about the diversity of the movement, because I think it really matters. You look around this room and lots of other rooms like it, we don't have it, and we don't have it in lots of dimensions, right? We obviously don't have it in sort of traditional diversity sense. People from minoritized communities are very underrepresented in the movement, but we also don't have it from those more socially conservative groups up there as well. So lots of backbone conservatives really concerned with protecting nature, lots of working class voices thinking, how's this going to make my life better? So how we bring that in as well, and don't just look at diversity on a single spectrum, I think is really important, but I don't have an answer.
Okay, great. We've got time for a few more points and questions to the floor, and then I will let the two speakers come back and sum up and send you away with their probably wildly divergent words of inspiration, which is great. So, yeah, over there, and then we've got another cam there. Yeah, off you go.
Thank you. So I think it's really interesting listening to you both talk and having that clarity on the both sides, like right before us. And I think there is a point for the protest, but we're protesting in the wrong place. So what you're just saying about ambulances being blocked, I'm trying to get to my aunt's or whatever, and I can't get there. Why are we not targeting the politicians? Make it impossible for them to do their job. Bring their systems down. Like the protests that are happening are very old school in such, and the world has changed. Technology has moved on, and it looks great in terms of visuals and media coverage and stuff. But is it changing anything? Probably not.
Okay, very good point. And there was a hand. Was there a hand here? No, there was a hand over here in the middle.
We'll take this one, and we've got one more online as well.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll come here and then go online. So keep your hand up so we can see who you are.
Thanks so much. The discussion's really interesting. I think one thing I wanted to ask about is just around these different frames and trying to reach these groups of people who maybe could be sympathetic to the environmental movement, but maybe require almost like different motivations or like framings or triggers to get there. Are there any particular channel, like how do you reach these distinct groups, right? Like it's not going to be about kind of just like pushing out all the types of messaging and like hoping that hoping that like the right people pick up on it. Is it about like how do you actually get those messages to those people in the most effective ways? And I can see how protests might be one of them for some of the groups, but there might be others that are useful for others.
Okay, admirably specific. So we got a point from online. This is people in the room and indeed online. This is your last chance really to get in. So get your hand up now so I can see how many of you there are. Off you go.
So the question from online, regarding the think tank, do you not get frustrated that the government actively tries to sow division to win votes, despite being against a relatively good thing for society, whether that's 20 miles an hour, living neighborhoods, cycle lanes, and so on.
Okay, hold that thought. Any other questions? This is literally your last chance. Don't be that I might do, I might not. This is your last chance. Counting down. Yes, there you go. Hat at the back. I mean, you know, you're a human being, but you've got a hat on, so it's not just a hat. In case you're worried online.
So my question was, do you think that the rise of sort of social media and how we use it has shifted the debate of people, and have we lost our ability to have a conversation, and how can we rectify that?
Very good, very big question. Have social media made us lose our ability to have conversations? Is that another online point?
We have a very popular one online, if we can sneak it in. What are your thoughts on the types of people that join all protests, no matter the cause, and use them as an outlet for broader dissent and frustration with very little knowledge of the cause? They can often become the centre of the media coverage and debate, rather those that are genuinely concerned and informed. How do we navigate this growing risk?
Okay, what a great point. Fantastic. And again, I suspect you two may disagree on the answers. So I'm going to let you come back in the order that you started with. So I'll start with you, Luke, and then Kirsty, you'll get the last word.
So I'll come back on the point about sort of reaching people, because I think, yeah, exactly, you can do all of this kind of analysis of what might work with different groups, but if you can't get it out to them, like, what's the point? We've done quite a lot on this, actually, and I think we can challenge ourselves to be even more creative. So obviously, you know, you can use different social media channels, but actually thinking a bit more about where do these different groups meet? What services do they use? You know, I remember some stat about, you know, more people read something like Tesco magazine than read most of the newspapers. How are you using that? For that loyal National Red Wall segment, they are significantly more likely, for instance, to watch I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. So is there a way of working with entertainment such as that? Probably not with Nigel Farage on it, but in general. So I think, yeah, really thinking about that, and there are, you know, having that kind of, it's a combination of having a multi-channel approach sometimes, but also sometimes the best use of something like that analysis is just checking you're not going to have something which loses you, one of them as well. So how do you get your 80% rather than just a 50% message out there? I think the point about social media is really interesting. I mean, I find Twitter a really useful conversation tool, but it also drives me mad as well. And the thing that I constantly have to remind myself is that everyone using it, including me, is not representative of the country at large. So it's good for communicating with other engaged people rather than anything else. And the final point, I'll come back on because it was directed to me for online, is yes, I get so frustrated by attempts to use this as a wedge. But what gives me hope is that actually it's going to be really unsuccessful. And I see part of our role as stopping it from becoming a self-fulfilling thing where, you know, Rishi Sunak says climate change is unpopular with working class voters, the press report it, and it becomes like that. Actually, by bringing the evidence, by showing that most people think it's absolutely ludicrous to start clamping down on 20-mile-an-hour zones when their priority is protecting the kids from getting hit by a speeding car. But actually being able to bring the evidence there, I think, is really important. And the best way to disrupt these narratives is to point people and to be able to evidence the decency and sense of fair play that the British public have across a whole series of issues.
Marvellous, thank you. So Kirsty, there you go. You have very little time, but you do have the last word. So make it punchy, concise, and send everyone away with lots of arguments burning to be had.
I completely agree that the key is to find those reasonable moral value systems that people held, those deeply core beliefs in fairness and justice, and to appeal to those. But I also want to win. And taking the public on a journey works when you have a decent amount of time. My concern is that with those discursive, persuasive strategies in the face of actually extremely coordinated narrative resistance from the other side, that extreme coordinated messaging that is deliberately dismantling that consensus, I worry that we are running out of time for rational, calm, reasonable debate. I also completely agree that we need that range of strategies, but they need to be targeted at the right people and the right places. But when they are, like for example, when Greenpeace cloaks a politician's empty home in fabric, we need to really resist the backlash that says even that is an unreasonable thing to do.
And we have run out of time here for what's been a really great discussion, I think. I hope you can at least agree on that, even though I also hope that you're all going away with lots of disagreements, that this is only the beginning of a lot of more discussion about exactly how to disagree. So please give a huge round of applause to the two panelists who I think really kicked things off well.